There is a law, most Americans have never heard of a law passed in 1792, that quietly laid the foundation for the most powerful currency the world has ever seen. It didn't make headlines in history class, it doesn't come up in economics textbooks, but without it, the American dollar might never have existed, and understanding what it said and what happened to it might be the most important financial history lesson you will ever get. This is the story of the Coinage Act of 1792, the money law America forgot. On the surface, it looked like a simple piece of legislation. A young nation needed its own currency, so Congress created a mint, defined the value of coins, and declared the dollar the official unit of account. Clean, practical, done, but buried in those clauses was something far more radical, a vision of what money should be, who it should serve, and what should happen to anyone who dared corrupt it. Here is the twist. Almost everything that Act stood for has been quietly dismantled over the past 230 years. What began as a declaration of monetary honesty has been replaced by a system of credit, inflation, and endless money creation. And most people have no idea it happened. So let's go back to where it all began. Picture Philadelphia in 1792. The United States was barely 10 years old. George Washington was in his first term, and Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant combative Treasury Secretary, was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He understood something that most of his contemporaries had fully grasped. Political independence meant nothing without financial independence. At that moment, America didn't have a unified currency. Not even close. Commerce ran on a chaotic patchwork of foreign coins, Spanish pieces of 8, British pounds, Dutch guilders, alongside a flood of privately issued paper notes that varied wildly in value, depending on who printed them and where you stood. A merchant in Boston might refuse the same note, a trader in Virginia happily accepted. The chaos wasn't just inconvenient, it was a threat, and Americans had already learned that lesson the hard way. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had printed paper money to finance the fight for independence. That money, the Continental dollar, collapsed spectacularly. Inflation ran out of control. The phrase "not worth a continental" became part of the American vocabulary, a bitter joke about worthless paper promises. Hamilton had watched all of this. He wasn't going to let it happen again. His answer was to build the monetary system on something real, something you could hold, weigh, and test. Something no politician could secretly inflate away. His answer was metal, gold and silver. The Coinage Act of 1792 established the United States, mint and declared the dollar as the nation's official currency. But what made it genuinely remarkable was how it defined that dollar. A dollar wasn't just a name, it wasn't just a concept. It was a precise, measurable quantity of silver. 371.25 grains, roughly 24 grams of pure silver. Not approximately, not somewhere around, exactly that amount. You could take any dollar coin, place it on a scale, and verify its value yourself. No trust required. No government official needed to vouch for it. The act also defined gold coins and fixed the ratio between gold and silver at 15:1. 1 gold dollar equaled 15 silver dollars in value. This bimetallic system wasn't arbitrary. It was designed with purpose. Gold scarce, dense with value, would anchor the broader economy and preserve long-term stability. Silver, more abundant and accessible, would handle the everyday needs of ordinary citizens, small purchases, local trade, wages. The founders understood that sound money had to serve everyone, not just the wealthy. But here's the part that stops most people cold when they first hear it. The Coinage Act made debasing the money supply punishable by death. That's not an exaggeration. If you were caught knowingly adulterating the coins, shaving the edges, mixing in cheaper metals, manipulating the weight, you could be executed. The founders did not treat monetary fraud as a financial technicality. They treated it as a moral crime. In their view, debasing the currency was theft. Invisible theft. Stealing not from one person but from every single American who held a dollar. The act also specified exactly who would run the mint: a director, an assayer, a chief coiner, and an engraver, all sworn under oath to uphold the purity of the metals. Even the design of the coins was spelled out in law. One face would bear the word liberty alongside a symbol of freedom. The other would carry an eagle, the emblem of the new republic. Every coin was intended to remind citizens that American money came from law, labor, and liberty, not from kings, not from private bankers, not from government favors. It was a system built on the idea that honest money was a civic right. For decades, it worked. The dollar earned a reputation as one of the most reliable currencies in the world. Merchants trusted it, foreign traders respected it, and ordinary Americans could save their earnings knowing that what they put away today would buy roughly the same thing a decade later. But the system had a flaw baked right into its foundation. The fixed ratio of 15-to-1 between gold and silver looked reasonable in 1792, but the real-world market value of those metals did not stay fixed. It never does. By the early 1800s, gold had become undervalued under American law. The result was predictable. Silver coins began disappearing. People melted them down or shipped them overseas, where they could receive better value. The cheaper metal stayed in circulation. The more valuable one vanished. This was Gresham's law playing out in real time. Bad money drives out good. The very mechanism designed to ensure monetary balance was instead creating shortages. Congress tried to fix the problem in 1834 by adjusting the ratio to approximately 16-to-1. The tweak had enormous unintended consequences. Now silver became undervalued. Silver coins evaporated from wallets and cash drawers. The United States had stumbled into a de facto gold standard decades before it officially adopted one. Then came the Civil War, and with it, the suspension of the entire founding ideal. The Union government was desperate. Armies do not run on principle, they run on money. And there was not enough metal to cover the cost of the conflict. So in 1861, Congress authorized the printing of paper money, the greenbacks. For the first time since 1792, American currency was not backed by anything physical. It was backed by a promise backed by faith and not much else. The consequences were swift. Inflation surged. Prices in some cities doubled. Soldiers were paid in paper that lost value before it reached their families. Meanwhile, those with access to gold, speculators, government contractors, and financiers prospered. The gap between those who owned money and those who merely used it widened dramatically. The moral line drawn in the Coinage Act had been crossed. After the war, the country faced a defining choice: return to the gold and silver standard of 1792, or embrace the new age of paper credit. The debate was fierce and deeply moral. Farmers and laborers wanted more money in circulation, easier credit, lighter debts, more green. Banks, bankers, creditors, and industrialists wanted hard money gold to protect their wealth from being eroded by inflation. It was not just an economic argument. It was a fight over who the American monetary system was actually for. In 1873, Congress quietly settled the debate, and most people never even noticed. Without significant public discussion, lawmakers passed legislation that demonetized silver. The dollar was now officially tethered to gold alone. Silver coins, which had circulated for generations, were effectively stripped of their monetary role. The bimetallic dream that had been the heart of the Coinage Act of 1792 was over. History would remember this as the crime of '73. The effects on ordinary Americans were brutal. Farmers who had borrowed money at one price level now had to repay those debts in a currency made more scarce and therefore more expensive by the gold standard. Deflation gripped the countryside. Agricultural prices collapsed. Small-town banks failed. Entire communities were squeezed into poverty. The anger was real, and it was righteous. Out of that anger came one of the most passionate political movements in American history. The Greenback Party, the Silverites, the Populists, all demanding a return to bimetallism, to a system that served the many instead of the few. Their champion was William Jennings Bryan. In 1896, he delivered one of the most electrifying speeches in American political history. Standing before the Democratic National Convention, he thundered, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan lost the election. Gold won. And by 1900, the Gold Standard Act made it official. The dollar was gold and only gold. The original vision of the Coinage Act, a balanced, accessible monetary system for every American, was gone. The 20th century moved fast, and each decade peeled away another layer of the original monetary framework. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created, a central bank with the power to set interest rates, control the money supply, and act as a lender of last resort. On paper, it was designed to stabilize the economy. In practice, it concentrated an extraordinary amount of financial power in a small group of unelected officials, exactly the kind of authority the founders had built the Coinage Act to prevent. Then came the Great Depression. The stock market collapsed in 1929. Banks failed by the thousands. Savings evaporated overnight. In a moment of collective panic, Americans did what their instincts told them to do. They clung to gold. They hoarded it. Because gold, whatever its imperfections, was the one form of money that couldn't be printed into oblivion. But that hoarding was strangling the economy. The government needed liquidity. It needed people spending, not hiding metal on the floorboards. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a move that would have been unthinkable to the founders. He signed an executive order requiring Americans to surrender their gold coins and certificates to the government in exchange for paper dollars. Private ownership of gold became illegal. The metal that had anchored American freedom for 141 years was now contraband. The official price of gold was then raised from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar overnight, concentrating the benefit of that revaluation in government coffers and leaving ordinary Americans holding paper that was worth less than it had been the day before. It was a quiet transfer of wealth from citizens to the state, executed through a redefinition of money itself. The war years brought a brief stability through the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which made the US dollar the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar. The system worked until it didn't. By the late 1960s, the US was spending heavily on both the Vietnam War and domestic programs. Dollars were flowing out of the country faster than gold could back them. Foreign governments, France most dramatically, reportedly sending a warship to New York to reclaim its gold holdings, began demanding metal in exchange for their dollars. The pressure became unbearable. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. No more gold for dollars. No fixed exchange. No metal anchor. That temporary measure never ended. From that moment, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, money backed not by any commodity, not by any measurable weight or fixed quantity, but by the declaration of a government and the faith of the people who used it. With a single announcement, nearly 180 years of monetary tradition were swept away. Here's how you measure what was lost. When the Coinage Act defined a dollar as 371.25 grains of pure silver, it anchored that dollar to something real. Today, that same weight of silver is worth somewhere between $20 and $25 in modern US dollars. In other words, the modern dollar has lost more than 95% of its purchasing power since the founding era. Every inflation chart you've ever seen, every rise in grocery prices, every shrinking paycheck that somehow doesn't stretch as far as it used to. That's the story of that loss of trust, playing out in slow motion, for generations. The founders understood something that our modern financial system has chosen to forget. Inflation is not just an economic condition. It is a moral one. When the value of money falls, it punishes the people who did the right thing, who worked hard, saved carefully, and planned responsibly. It rewards those who borrowed heavily and spent freely. It quietly transfers wealth from the prudent to the powerful. Economists call this the Cantillon effect. When new money is created, it doesn't reach everyone at the same time. It flows first to those closest to the source: banks, large financial institutions, government contractors. By the time it filters down to workers and savers, prices have already adjusted upward. The benefit has been captured. The cost is spread across everyone else. In 1792, shaving the edges of a coin to pocket a bit of silver dust was a capital crime. In 2025, expanding the money supply by trillions of dollars is called monetary policy. The tools are more sophisticated. The language is more academic. But the transfer of wealth from those who hold money to those who create it is the same. The Coinage Act of 1792 was America's first firewall against exactly this kind of corruption, and it has been methodically dismantled, piece by piece, over 2 centuries. America isn't the first civilization to try this experiment. History is full of empires that discovered how to stretch their money supply and how that experiment ends. Ancient Rome began debasing its silver coins in the 3rd century. The denarius, once 90% pure silver, was reduced to a thin silver coating over bronze. Inflation followed, trade collapsed, the empire's economic stability unraveled. Revolutionary France printed paper money, called assignats, backed by the value of confiscated land. Within a few years, hyperinflation had destroyed the currency. Prices rose 13,000%. The government lost all credibility. Weimar Germany in the 1920s became the textbook example. The government printed money to pay its World War I reparations and domestic debts. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers were paid twice a day because prices rose faster than they could spend their wages. The currency became literally worthless. Every one of these governments believed it could control the outcome. Everyone was wrong. The lesson isn't that paper money is evil or that gold is magic. The lesson is simpler and more universal. When those who control money are not constrained by something outside themselves, whether metal power or genuine accountability, they will eventually abuse that power. And when they do, it is always ordinary people who pay the price. The founders of the American Republic read this history. They understood it. The Coinage Act was their answer, a written constraint on monetary power, backed by the most serious penalty they could impose, not because they were naive, because they knew exactly how these stories tend to end. We are living through the next chapter of this story in real time. The modern dollar exists almost entirely as numbers on screens. Physical cash makes up only a small fraction of the actual money supply. The vast majority is credit entries in digital ledgers, created when banks issue loans, expanded when central banks conduct their operations. Money has become, in the truest sense, information. That digitization has made transactions extraordinarily fast and convenient, but it has also concentrated control in ways the founders couldn't have imagined. Governments can freeze accounts. Central banks can create or destroy liquidity with keystrokes. The entire architecture of money has become a tool of governance. Now central banks around the world, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, are actively developing central bank digital currencies. A CBDC could theoretically replace physical cash entirely, and if that happens, money stops being a neutral medium of exchange. It becomes a system of programmable permissions. Spending limits could be set, expiration dates attached, certain categories of purchases blocked. Financial access could be revoked without a court order, without a public hearing, without even a law. The oldest principle in economic liberty, that the money you earn as your property, could effectively disappear. Meanwhile, something else is happening. Nations that spent decades dismissing gold as a relic of the past are quietly buying it again at record rates. Central banks across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe are diversifying away from the dollar. And ordinary people, frustrated by rising prices and stagnant wages, are asking questions their parents' generation never thought to ask. What actually gives money its value? Who benefits when more of it is created? And how much of my work is real if what I earn loses value before I can use it? These are old questions dressed in new clothes. They are the same questions that animated the Coinage Act of 1792. They are the same questions William Jennings Bryan was asking in 1896, and they do not have comfortable answers. The Coinage Act of 1792 was not really about coins. It was about the relationship between citizens and their government. It was a declaration that money, the medium through which people exchange their labor, their time, their creative energy, belongs to the people who earn it, not to the institutions that manage it. It was an attempt to protect ordinary Americans from a very specific kind of tyranny, the invisible theft of purchasing power. That act encoded a set of beliefs into law. That value should be measurable. That honesty in money is a moral obligation, not just a technical preference. That those who manipulate the currency are not economic managers. They are thieves. Those beliefs have been largely abandoned. The modern financial system has replaced them with flexibility, with stimulus, with the language of policy management. And there are real arguments for that. Flexibility economies are complex, crises are real, and rigid systems can break in ways that cause tremendous human suffering. But flexibility without accountability always trends toward abuse, and the history of every monetary system ever tried confirms it. The failure of the Coinage Act's vision didn't happen because its principles were wrong. It happened because those principles became inconvenient for those in power. And so, generation by generation, the rules were rewritten. The death penalty for debasement was replaced with a press conference explaining why inflation is actually a sign of a healthy economy. The coins still say liberty. The mint still operates. But the substance behind those words has been hollowed out. Here is what the founders knew that we keep having to rediscover. The integrity of a nation's currency is a direct measure of its moral character. When money is honest, commerce is fair, saving is rewarded, and citizens can build lives they control. When money is dishonest, when it can be created at will, devalued quietly, and weaponized by those in power, freedom itself becomes negotiable. The Coinage Act of 1792 was America's attempt to make sure that never happened. We forgot it, and now we're living with the consequences. Understanding that history doesn't mean going back. You can't unmake 230 years of financial evolution. But it does mean asking the right questions about what money is, who it serves, and whether the system we have is truly working for the people who live inside it. Because the debate that began in 1792 has never really ended. It's just wearing a different suit. And the next chapter is being written right now.